Welcome back to Across the Pond. I'm Angus Scott in London. The Khalistan movement in recent years has gained huge traction both domestically in Punjab, but also, and even to a larger degree, across the Sikh diaspora. Its spectacular growth and the threat it poses to the ruling elite's control over India has pushed them into extraordinary tactics that would put even the former Soviet Union to shame by murdering citizens of America and Europe on their own soil, campaigning just for the establishment of their own sovereign Sikh nation. The reputational damage to India mounts up even as it fights for a seat at the global top table. So, to discuss the growth of the Khalistan movement and India's attempts to quell it, I'm joined as always by our special US correspondent, Leyla Gulen. Leyla, good morning, welcome.
Oh, wonderful to see you, Angus. I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
Indeed, absolutely, and good to talk to you again. And of course, one of our favourite subjects, it is, of course, Khalistan. Lots of issues related around this, but today's topic hopefully will touch on some of the more interesting and key elements leading up to this huge growing momentum of this campaign.
Oh, absolutely. Well, why don't we start here? You know, it's clear that the Khalistan movement is being buoyed, particularly by the Sikh diaspora across the world and outside India itself. So why is the Khalistan discourse arguably more visible and active in countries like Canada, the UK, Australia, more so than in Punjab itself today?
Yeah, this is a good question because often many of the critics of the campaign certainly comment on our shows quite regularly saying, well, you know, it's clearly not a big issue in Punjab because the only people who are campaigning for it seem to be outside the Punjab, outside India. They seem to be in the diaspora. They seem to be the only people who care about it. Well, there actually is a very good reason for that, and it's a reason that we often just have to keep reiterating. It's primarily because if you campaign for an independent state of Khalistan in the Punjab, you are more likely to end up in prison. And as part of that process, it's likely you'll also get tortured in the process, as has been reported over and over again. Because to argue and to even actively campaign for something that we would actually take for granted in any normal democratic state here in the West, if you want to campaign for secessionism, for independence of any part of your country, it is illegal in India. Now, here in the UK, in Canada, we've seen independence movements very actively lobbying, campaigning very publicly, very vocally, and even having referenda in those respects. Because again, we are democratic nations that respect the whole concept of democracy. If sufficient people support the idea, then they have the democratic right to campaign, get a referendum, and if they vote accordingly, then of course international law and democratic norms would allow that independence movement to succeed to a new sovereign state. But this is where India fails. India is always the first country to sort of stand up and say, we are the largest democracy in the world. And yet, if you try that very same tactic in the Punjab and say, we want an independent Punjab, we want Khalistan, you will be the subject of the law, because India has now weaponized the law against any independence movement. And this actually goes back historically, ever since pretty much 1947. And the Khalistan movement has its roots a long way back in the 20th century. And originally there were many areas actually of India post-partition of 1947 that were, campaigning actively for their own independence. And of course, the ruling elite of India, who inherited India from the British ruling elite, they essentially took colonial control of India. These disparate parts of India that, again, were united by brute force under the British, continued to be united essentially under similar brute force, a subtle brute force, by the Indian rulers, the ruling elite, the Brahmins, the upper caste. And anybody who broke against that model, that concept of a unified India, became the victim of laws. India, the ruling elite, actually made it illegal to argue for secessionism, to argue for any independence of any part of India, and the evidence is writ large right across India's quite relatively recent history. In 1963, the early 1960s, there was this Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu in southern India. They were fighting likewise for their independence. They wanted to break away from this artificial concept of India. So the Dravidian movement, they themselves were battling politically and otherwise for independence. But once again, the Indian government at the time, they actually then said, OK, we will make this an illegal act. They were quite shrewd in the way they did it. They weaponized the law. Not just it wasn't just about sending in the troops to quell any dissent by, again, brute force. They said, let's be a bit more subtle about it. Let's be a bit more 20th century about it. Let's make it illegal to argue for what, again, we take as a democratic right, to argue for your own independence. So under Nehru at the time, he actually made it an illegal act for the Dravidians to announce or to campaign for any independence. And after that point, that really set the precedent legally in India that any talk of secessionism, any activism, any campaigning would be seen as an illegal act. And it came under Section 3 of this new act, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Now, this act was quite it's a piece of legislation that has been criticised by just about every democratic nation in the world. And it's a piece of legislation that was written very deliberately to allow almost a blanket, carte blanche, open opportunity for the Indian government to declare anything it doesn't like, any dissent, anything. It's lowered the legal threshold so low and so loosely that the Indian government can declare anything it actually doesn't like as in breach of Section 3 of the UAPA. And that's what they did. So any talk of secessionism was essentially declared as unlawful. And the an sort of the legal wording around this act itself allows the Indian government to declare any what it calls association unlawful if the government believes that that association aims to carry out actions, in its opinion, detrimental to the sovereignty and integrity of the nation. So again, you can start to see how any talk of secessionism can very easily fall under this, because it's very easy for the government saying, well, it's detrimental to the sovereignty and integrity of India. It's been used over and over again. It was used in Manipur, for example. The same Section 3 under UAPA was used against all the local Maitai tribal secessionist groups as they became unlawful associations. Likewise, they were therefore legally banned, and anybody who was seen publicly as a member of any of those organisations could then be locked up and under Indian legal process, basically locked up and the key thrown away. That's the way it works. But it's also been used ever since. We have Amrit Pal Singh, this Punjabi politician who now leads Waris Punjab Day, the new political party. It's a new version of Shiromani Akali Dal, Waris Punjab Day. He campaigned on a pro-Khalistan ticket. Lo and behold, huge manhunt. He's locked up and essentially the key thrown away again. He's just locked in this legal limbo. So he will be in prison, until when, we don't know. But again, under this really questionable piece of legislation. And even again, recently, we have Gurdwaras Singh Panoon. He's an active campaigner based in New York. He was a co-founder of Sikhs for Justice, this organisation that have been really active in the Khalistan campaign. They're actually organising the referendum around the diaspora. Even Gurdwaras Singh Panoon has now been declared as part of this group, Sikhs for Justice, SFJ, which themselves are now declared legally in India as an unlawful association. Yes, this word again, association. So SFJ has itself been declared an unlawful association under Section 3 of the UAPA. So you can start to see this pattern, how India, and this is a well-worn phrase, India has weaponized its legal system to ensure that no part of India could ever go independent, even despite there might be a huge democratic support for it, that there will be a huge democratic mandate for it. India, the ruling elite of India, will never let it happen as long as they are in control. And backing up all of this, of course, is a complete lack of press freedom. There is no accountability on behalf of the Indian press. Again, we take for granted here in the West that our media, generally speaking, will always hold our governments to account. They can criticise and hold our governments to account. If the government here in the West tried to weaponise the law against its dissenters, the press would be straight on it. There'd be scandals. It would be front page news. Not in India. Unfortunately, India languishes down in the bottom part of the World Free Press Index because its media is tightly controlled by the same ruling elite who will not allow any talk of secessionism. So there you go. That's why, sadly, you will not see much activity in the Punjab, and it has to only occur in genuinely free democratic nations like America, like Europe, Leyla.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I want to talk about the role of Gurdwaras and institutions. So to what extent are religious institutions or community centers involved in hosting or funding pro-Khalistan events and campaigns?
Yeah, of course, the Gurdwaras are the focal point. They are the communal focal point for the Sikh communities right around the world, whether in the Punjab or across the diaspora. And Gurdwaras, essentially, by definition, are a focal point for the worship of the religion. It is the practice of the religion. They are, of course, the central sort of religious cause of the community. But in doing so, they also form that community centre. They're a community centre for the whole local diaspora to get together and discuss all their issues. And of course, many of those issues are nothing to do with Khalistan. They're just obviously just issues reflecting their own local communities. But naturally, there is Sikhi has a concept called Miri Piri. And Miri Piri goes all the way back really to almost the early days of the religion. Is that Miri Piri it's all about, it combines Miri and Piri, which is all about Miri, which is like a political obligation, and Piri, which is a spiritual obligation. It marries these two obligations under Sikhi, is that you should always fight for political rights, political freedoms, and spiritual rights and spiritual freedoms. In other words, those two concepts are intertwined. They are inextricably linked. In other words, the Sikh religion is built around the foundation that every Sikh has an almost moral obligation to fight against oppression, to fight against injustice, to fight against anything negative that would negatively impact the community. And by extension, that obviously implies that politics. So, of course, anything political, there is a moral obligation amongst the Sikh community to fight back against any political oppression. And therefore, it then starts to bring in, well, why actually in Punjab, for example, do we not have this freedom of expression? We don't have the freedoms that, for example, we enjoy here in Europe or in North America. Those same freedoms are not practiced in Punjab. We don't have that same freedom of speech that we have over here. We can talk freely about Khalistan. As I've just said, you can't do that in the Punjab. So again, it's not surprising then that many Gurdwaras do actually talk regularly about the whole concept of Khalistan. Now, many of the smaller ones don't. I mean, again, they've got more important things in their lives. Many people amongst the community really don't discuss the concept of Khalistan too much because they might not be very aware of it. They're just not interested in politics. I mean, they're human beings like many of us. Many people in all societies just are not interested in politics. We don't care. We care about keeping a roof overhead. We care about going to our job, putting food on the table. Bigger issues like this, they just don't care. That's perfectly ordinary, normal. There's nothing wrong with that. But of course, there are the more politically minded, and it's in those Gurdwaras where those people then use those Gurdwaras as centres to get like-minded people together to discuss such concepts. So again, it depends which Gurdwara you go to, but certainly across North America, certainly here in the UK, some of the larger Gurdwaras particularly, they are very politically minded because, again, that whole political concept of Khalistan, because essentially it is a political concept. It is so embedded within Sikhi faith, Sikhi concepts, Sikhi issues that, of course, it becomes a topic of conversation. And in fact, here in the UK, we actually had an issue recently I think it was Slough, one of the Gurdwaras near London. It actually had a plaque saying Khalistan in the Gurdwara. It was up on the wall. And an Indian journalist who was a guest in the Gurdwara saw this plaque, and he made a complaint to the British government, actually to the local authorities, saying, no, you're not allowed for political slogans to infiltrate or to be displayed in a place of worship, because the places of worship in the UK are seen as charities. They operate under charitable status, which means they cannot be politically affiliated. And this Indian journalist argued legally, saying, oh, but Khalistan is a political issue. Anyway, long story short, fortunately, the Gurdwara won that because they argued that Khalistan is so embedded in the Sikh faith, the Sikh faith as we call it here, is so embedded within the faith that you can't disengage it. It's not purely a political issue. It is also part of our religious practice. Khalistan is a fundamental foundation of the Sikh faith. The whole sovereignty, the whole issue of our ability to operate freely on our own sovereign territory, that is a fundamental founding principle of who we are as a community. So ultimately, Leyla, the Gurdwaras, to a smaller and to a greater extent, depending which Gurdwara it is, do get involved, but they are, as I say, these essential focal points for the community to get together and help organise such things. So they are really a really important part of the pro-Khalistan infrastructure.
Sure. Well, let's not forget, one of the key drivers of the Khalistan movement was the terrible attack on the Harmandir Sahib, the Golden Temple in 1984 and the subsequent genocide later that year. So how does the memory of 1984 get preserved and transmitted to second and third generation Sikhs living overseas?
Yeah, this is very important. History, heritage is, of course, extraordinarily important to any culture because no culture has an identity, no culture even has a future without acknowledging its history, its past, its heritage. And this is something that the Sikh people do very well, as indeed they have to, because they are a relatively small community, globally speaking. And there are forces out there that we refer to regularly who are intent, who are motivated to drive it out of existence. So it is absolutely imperative and it is beholden on every Sikh of every generation to pass this knowledge down to the younger generations. Because the younger generations, there is a huge challenge here. Our younger generations are always distracted. There are so many distractions in the modern world. We have the internet, we have 1,000 channels on the media, we have YouTube and the, handheld games and mobile phones. So again, there's so many distractions to attract our attention's youth away from boring, dry old subjects like our history. So there is that challenge there, but ultimately it really is important. Unfortunately, the young, generally speaking, do actually find an interest in their culture, especially if it's practiced at home. If they are within a Sikh practicing family, if their parents are there, their grandparents are there, and many of these older generations have lived through some of these really terrible times. Of course, we had, as you said, in 1984, the incidents in 1984, we had the genocide in October, November. We had the terrible attack on the Golden Temple in June of that year, 1984. So there are parents of youngsters now who actually were around at that time. Many of the campaigners now are actively campaigning now as a direct result of their own first-hand or second-hand experience of what happened in 1984. And of course, we have those who, the very, very old generation now, 1947, sadly, of course, they're dying out now. But there are, and in recent times, there were those of the grandparent and great-grandparent generations who were around in the days of partition. Those awful genocidal times when over 1 million people died in the carnage of partition. So again, there are those, very few sadly, but there are those alive who remember these key dates, these key events that helped shape the history and the heritage of the Sikh community. Likewise, again, recent history, the extrajudicial killings in the Punjab of the 1980s and the 1990s, again, where 100,000 plus young Sikh men were murdered in cold blood and disappeared from Punjab. So likewise, there are family members who were there at that time who remember their colleagues, friends, brothers, fathers, etc., literally disappearing. So again, they have this first-hand experience of these terrible events. And it's these terrible events that must never be forgotten, because it's these terrible events that drive the motivation of the young, that really ignite the fire in the young to take the culture forward, but more importantly, to fight for the whole concept of Khalistan. Khalistan is nothing without its heritage, without its history, because that is the foundation. That is the foundational principle of what will govern, what will manage, and what Khalistan will stand for. It will stand for that, what's called the Panj Pyari, that whole model of governance originating back in the Sikh Empire. Those are the foundations that will establish Khalistan, and those are the foundations that need to be passed on just literally through word of mouth. Fortunately now, through all these different elements of media, we have videos, we have the wonderful ability to create animations, to create films, we can talk about it in podcasts, all these sorts of things. The media is there now to help keep this message alive and keep passing it down to the younger generations. So it is absolutely imperative that this continues generation to generation, because that is what will keep the culture alive.
Yeah, indeed. And, a movement now as large as the Khalistan campaign does require significant resources to help build and grow it and indeed maintain its enormous momentum globally. So where does the current financial support for overseas Khalistan link groups originate?
Yeah, this is a good question. It's actually a very hard one to answer because, of course, yeah, as you rightly say, every campaigning group, every movement does require quite a large amount of resources to keep it going. And the Khalistan movement has actually grown so powerfully and so big now that, again, it is literally spread across the world. It does require an awful lot of resources to get people together. It's just a simple, literally paying for the logistics, paying for the campaigning, paying for the media, all these sorts of things that help support and grow the movement. So where does this money come from? Well, I mean, specifically, I don't know the answer, and I can't sort of give facts and figures on this, but it's not hard to work out in all likelihood where it does come from. Basically, again, back to the sort of the principles of Sikhi. One of the key principles, the foundational principles of Sikhi is what's called seva, which is selfless service. It is helping your fellow human being. It is giving part of what you have to others who need that, who have a greater need to yourself. Even if you go to a Gurdwara, as indeed I have done, there is as you walk in, you have to hand over a sort of an offering, a financial offering, as part of your visit to the Gurdwara. But again, it's so inbuilt, and this whole principle of giving is really behind what is financing the Khalistan movement, because of course the pro-Khalistan feeling amongst the Sikh community is deep. It is deeply powerful. It's deeply motivated. It is strong because it does, of course, come back. It has its roots so historically in the Sikh community, back through previous generations. So it is so deeply instilled in so many Sikhs now. More and more, again, Sikhs are waking up the whole concept of Khalistan and actually believing it's becoming a reality, that they're thinking, you know what, actually we need to help support this. So it's not just about getting out there with your banner and getting on the streets, which of course is a huge part of it, but it is donating. It's going to the Gurdwaras, it's donating money and whatever you have to the cause. And so a lot of the resources that are funding a lot of the media pushes, the PR campaigns, the lobbying, the visits to the United Nations, etc., etc. The whole legal framework that needs to be put into place to take the whole concept of Khalistan legally it has to be funded somehow. And again, these come from contributions from members within the Sikh community who are deeply motivated to make Khalistan happen, to push the whole concept over the line. And of course, the one great thing that really helps this whole concept is that Sikhs, and I often refer to this, is that Sikhs have a genetic inbuilt motivation to be entrepreneurial. Wherever the Sikh diaspora has landed, around, whether it's North America, whether it's Europe, whether it's the Southern Hemisphere, wherever they have landed, they build, they create, they grow, they build businesses. They are driven to be entrepreneurial. They don't sit idle. They build lives, they build businesses, they create commercial enterprises. And so the Sikh community, and again, I don't have facts and figures to hand, but I do know that the Sikh community is disproportionately commercially successful compared to most other diaspora communities. They, as I said, they just have this ability to build business. And as a result of that, they build successful enterprise, which again helps feed commercially, helps feed financially the whole Khalistan concept. So there are very many very powerful and unfortunately very wealthy individuals in the community who are motivated enough to, thank heaven, support the whole Khalistan concept. So that is my belief, and I suspect that's probably very close to the truth, Leyla.
Yeah, very interesting. You mentioned that in the introduction, the worst kept secret that the Indian state are in all likelihood behind the murders and attempted murders of several high-profile Khalistan campaigners. So what are the specifics of the allegations made by Canada regarding the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar? And how has this event fundamentally altered the bilateral relationship?
Yeah, it's Canada, I have to say, and I do say this regularly. I take my hat off to Justin Trudeau, and I'm no particular fan of Justin Trudeau, but I will always give him credit for having the courage to stand up to what happened to Hardeep Singh Nijjar, to stand up to India and call it out for exactly what it was. It was clearly a blatant extrajudicial murder of a democratic campaigner on sovereign soil of another nation. In fact, he was a citizen of a foreign nation. So the act itself was absolutely outrageous. And as I said in the introduction, it is a sort of act that we would have expected of the Soviet Union back in the day, back in the days of the Cold War, this sort of authoritarian regime that was not afraid of it. But even the Soviet Union had rules about how it operated. And again, it only removed or assassinated people that it really could justify. But India really has gone all out in killing Khalistani campaigners extrajudicially. And Canada, of course, they did it on Canadian soil. Hardeep Singh Nijjar was a Canadian citizen. So he was murdered by someone on Canadian soil, essentially for being a Khalistan campaigner, a peaceful, democratic Khalistan campaigner. So Justin Trudeau called it out. And he actually called it out in, I have to say, almost an unprecedented way. He stood up in the Canadian Parliament and he actually accused the Indian state of being behind this. Now, this was an enormous thing to do. Diplomatically speaking, it was nuclear. It was the nuclear option. Just, global leaders, presidents, prime ministers, just don't do this sort of thing. unless they have absolute evidence that they know supports that accusation. So Justin Trudeau, when he made this accusation at huge risk to his own political capital, he made this accusation and he used the phrase, "I have credible evidence." Again, he would not have made the accusation unless he knew, he was pretty damn sure that the Indian government were behind that murder. Now, again, it damaged him politically at home. It was used, his opposition used it against him. So he lost political capital by doing this thing. But he had the guts, the courage to stand up to essentially what was an outrageous act. Now, there is no way, as I said, that he would have made that accusation without credible evidence. So clearly, Canada has credible evidence that the Indian government were behind this killing. Now, it has since come out, and in fact, subsequent to that accusation, that there was quite a huge, well, I'm surprised there's a huge diplomatic fallout, and Canada expelled, I think it's about 40 odd diplomats from Canada, Indian diplomats back to India. There was a tit for tat. India did the same with Canadian diplomats, unsurprisingly. But again, Canada stood up for its principles. It stood up for the rule of law. It stood up for democratic principles. It would not have done it without the evidence, and that evidence, as it since came out, was probably supplied by the Five Eyes intelligence nations. In other words, its allies, the US, the UK, etc. In other words, by implication, it stated that evidence was already known and is common knowledge amongst North America, as in the United States, amongst the UK, amongst Australia, New Zealand, etc. So in other words, it, again, as I think I even said in the introduction, it's one of the worst kept secrets that the Indian government were behind these things. Now, there is a contrast how the other nations have actually dealt with it. Because the United States, for example, the US, likewise, probably fed a lot of this intelligence to their counterparts at CSIS, the Canadian Intelligence Services. Because in the US, they've got a similar case. Gurdwaras Singh Pannoon, the co-founder of Sikhs for Justice, there was an assassination attempt shortly after the Hardeep Singh Nijjar case. There was an assassination attempt on Gurdwaras Singh Pannoon. Now, to demonstrate the clumsiness of the Indian intelligence services, of course, they needed plausible deniability. So there was always a firebreak about those who were going to undertake the assassination and those intelligence operatives behind them. And so, of course, there's these sort of loose bonds that were easily breakable if they ever got caught. And, of course, it was those loose bonds that allowed a lot of clumsiness to enter the operation. It was that clumsiness that basically got them caught. Because, essentially, the guy on the ground, a guy called Nikhil Gupta, was caught trying to recruit a hitman to murder Gurdwaras Singh Pannoon. Turns out that hitman was actually an agent for the DEA. So, of course, the whole conversation was recorded, or I think it was on video camera, it was recorded on tape, etc. And this is how they know and have a very good idea of who was behind it. Because this guy, Nikhil Gupta, apparently showed the DEA agent, he showed a video or photographs of the killing of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, the body of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And only if he was linked to that case, that's the only way he ever could have got hold of those photographs or that video, whatever, was if he was involved also, at least indirectly, in that same murder. In other words, there was a clear link between the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar and the potential assassination of Gurdwaras Singh Pannoon. He also referred to operatives back in India that he was reporting back to Indian intelligence, and he referred to all sorts of, he said, we have lots of targets. In other words, there is a large policy to murder Khalistani campaigners across certainly North America at the very least. So again, so the evidence, the credible evidence, is all out there. And the US government and the US law enforcement agencies are aware of this. The Department of Justice are now investigating the case of Nikhil Gupta. But Nikhil Gupta, we know, reported into a guy called, codenamed CC1. Again, it subsequently came out, the CC1 was a guy called Vikas Yadav. Vikas Yadav is a former RAW officer, a research and analysis wing, that's the Indian intelligence agency. So he was a former RAW officer, CC1. Now CC1, Yadav, reported into a guy called Samant Goel. He was the chief of RAW, so he was the RAW chief at the time. And Samant Goel, likewise, has a history with the Sikh people. He was chief, he was the guy in charge of several operations that massacred Sikhs in the Punjab back in the 1990s. So this guy himself has got history, anti-Sikh history. So Vikas Yadav reporting into Samant Goel, head of RAW. Now, the head of RAW, there's no way that he wouldn't have known about this operation. It's just not operationally possible that he would have not known about this operation. Likewise, by implication, there is no way that Samant Goel would know this and not have informed his boss, Ajit Doval, the national security agency officer, advisor, the National Security Advisor of the Indian government, the right-hand man of Narendra Modi. So in other words, just by implication, you don't even need the proof, but just by logical implication, is that this chain of knowledge, at least, not necessarily orders, but certainly knowledge of the operation, goes all the way up to the very top in India. And this is what the US knows. This is what Canada knows. This is what we all know. It's the worst kept secret. And the proof probably is there. We probably have the evidence, despite all the denials on both sides. And the US is, again, there's a divide between what the politicians say and what law enforcement say. Because law enforcement, we are focused on the law. We will just execute the law without fear or favour. That is what they do. But the politicians then have to tread this difficult line of trying to balance, we've got to follow democratic rule of law, etc. But at the same time, we've still got to try and maintain diplomatic relations with India. So again, there's this sort of dilemma that we're always dancing around. And then finally, the United Kingdom, and of course one of the Five Eyes nations, the UK, is also linked and implicated in this whole web of assassinations, because we had one of our own campaigners probably assassinated by India. On the 15th of June, I think this was 2 or 3 days before the murder of Hardeep Singh Nijjar, Avtar Singh Kandar, he was a campaigner from the Midlands here in the UK. He was falsely accused of removing the Indian flag from the Indian High Commission in London during a protest. It was a pro-Khalistan protest outside the Indian High Commission. The flag was removed, and lots of arrests, etc. But the Indian media and the Hindutva forces jumped on this, and they falsely accused Avtar Singh Kandar of being the guy who ripped down the Indian flag. And even the Indian media afterwards, the Godi media as it's called, the pet media of the government, said we have a hit list. Here is the raw hit list of people that we believe are going to be assassinated or taken out by RAW. Avtar Singh Kandar's name was on that list. Lo and behold, a few days, even just before Hardeep Singh Nijjar, he was in perfectly good health. He was suddenly admitted to intensive care here in the UK. He died 3 days later allegedly of acute myeloid leukemia. Again, this is a guy who was fit and healthy literally days before, and 3 days later, he's dead, out of the blue. Now, this whole operation, if indeed it was an assassination operation, has been totally buried by the British government. The British government at the time was run by Rishi Sunak, a practicing Hindu with known good friendly relations with Narendra Modi. So all the accusations have been, well, we had this Hindu prime minister who's buddy with Narendra Modi, and that had this rather uncomfortable situation of one of our Sikh citizens here murdered on British soil. Well, we'd better quietly brush this under the carpet. It could prove slightly embarrassing. And so, of course, there was no normal protocols of investigation undertaken by the local police force, West Midlands Police. The coroner's office didn't undertake what they should have taken full toxicology investigations, which they didn't. So again, there was a whole sequence of events that actually implies and reveals the likelihood that the whole thing was buried deliberately by the British state. And again, you can pick your reasons why that was the case. So you can see the contrast of how Canada has dealt with India and these extrajudicial killings, this transnational oppression, and how the US has dealt with it, but certainly how the UK has dealt with it. And they do really contrast quite significantly, Leyla.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. Well, let me ask you this. For the Khalistan movement to succeed, it will have to persuade global leaders to align with the concept and to support it. So political influence is therefore one of the key drivers behind the movement. So how significant is the Sikh diaspora in domestic politics across particularly the English-speaking world? So how much influence does the diaspora have in foreign policy decisions of countries like Canada, the US, and the UK?
Yeah, this is a very important area for the Sikh community, because one thing that the Sikh community is very good at, that's political grassroots lobbying. It's very good at getting out there and campaigning on behalf of its key issues, of which there are many. And as a result of this, and again, part of Miri Puri, the concept of Miri Puri, is that the Sikh community as a whole do feel this moral obligation to get involved, to get out there and be active, to politically lobby about the issues that directly affect them. And as a result of this, right across the diaspora, there have been, I would say, a disproportionately successful lobbying examples in so many areas. Now, if we take, let's take some of the diaspora in turn. The Canadian diaspora is the largest diaspora outside of the Punjab. Now, the Canadian, here's some facts and figures just to sort of help sort of put some meat on the bones of the whole story, is that the Canadian Sikh population is round about 800,000. Now, that accounts for just under 2% of the Canadian population. So it's a minority, but it's not an insignificant minority. But at the same time, the Sikh community, again, has been very active in Canadian politics. For example, we had even the leader of one of the larger political parties, the New Democratic Party, was himself a Sikh. It was Jagmeet Singh. Sadly, he lost his seat at the last elections, but he was a very high-profile Sikh leader of a national political party. So again, very, very demonstrative of how successful the Sikh community had been in getting involved in Canadian politics. Likewise, in the Canadian Parliament, there are 18 Sikh MPs, 7 in the Conservative Party, 11 for the Liberals. Now, of those 18 MPs, that amounts to about just over 5% of the Canadian Parliament. So again, although they're just 2% of the overall population, they have just over 5% voice within the Canadian Parliament. So again, you can see how successful they have been in terms of getting involved in Canadian politics, and therefore, as a result, they are starting to influence to some degree, even although it might be a minority degree, but they are at least having a say. Their voice is actually very active within the Canadian Parliament in terms of influencing policy, getting things over the line, getting legislation that will impact in a positive way the local Sikh community. So again, it's very much a success story in Canada. And this actually cascades down to the next layer of governance, which is the MLAs, the legislative assemblies, and that Sikhs have, I think it's 25 members of the legislative assemblies. And again, it's very much cross-party. It's split between the Conservatives and the New Democratic Party, and I think there's one Liberal. But again, that amounts to just over 5%. So a very similar proportion in the legislative assemblies, that lower level of governance. So again, a very, very positive success story in Canada. In the US, there are, again, it's very hard to get a precise figure of how many Sikhs there are in the US. It's estimated somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000, and the sort of the official figure, although not confirmed, is about 280,000. Now, most of those are based in California. I think 52% of Sikhs in the US are in California. So again, you can see how Californian politics particularly will be affected and influenced by the Sikh community. 11% in New York, 6% in Washington. So again, there's very much a bias towards Californian politics, and it's why actually we see Californian politics so often in the news, particularly when it comes to Sikh issues within the US, because again, the community in California is so sizable. Now, one of the high-profile figures in California who's been very much in the news recently is Jasmeet Bains. She's a lady, Jasmeet Kaur Bains. She's a lady who's been. She actually is a member of the California State Assembly. And she has been, I think, for the last 3 years. And she was the first South Asian American woman, and indeed the first Sikh American, elected to the body. So again, she's a huge success story for the Sikh community getting involved in active politics. And she was, again, very instrumental in what was up to the final hurdle, the success of SB 509, this piece of legislation, this bill that was going to install anti-transnational repression operations and training, etc., to try and combat TNR. So she was, again, very much behind that. And again, that all stemmed back in the Californian State Assembly. So, but notwithstanding all that, and again, there are Sikh politicians at all levels of US politics, from well, not I would say the very top, but sadly doesn't reach up into the White House, although there are people behind the scenes from the Sikh community in the White House, but also all through all the state bodies in the US, there are Sikhs to a greater or lesser degree. So they are involved, and they are slowly but surely working their way upwards. But again, it is a very small minority. I think it's less than 0.0001% of the US population. So proportionally, that's how small they are as a minority diaspora, but politically they probably are equally as disproportionately positive in US politics as north of the border in Canada. So, and then It's also worth mentioning, of course, but what also occurs in the United States is the Sikh Coalition. This is an extraordinarily successful lobbying organisation, again, representing the views and the issues of the Sikh community. The Sikh Coalition has campaigned massively on all issues affecting the Sikh community. It's very active, it's very high profile, it is very public, and again, it's got a string of successes in introducing all sorts of positive pieces of legislation, positive curricula insertions into schools. In other words, schools now, Sikh faith is embedded into many of the state's curriculum, etc. So they've had loads and loads of successful campaigns. Again, the politically influenced. But they, again, this small, or not so small, but this very disproportionately powerful lobby group has, again, a long string of success stories in the United States. And then finally, here in the UK, we have our population here in the UK, 520,000 is the official figure. That represents just under 1% of our population. And politically, again, I would say a disproportionately successful political lobbying on behalf of our community here in the UK. In the House of Commons, which is our lower house of Parliament, we have 11 Sikh MPs. That's about 1.7% of the Houses of Parliament. So 1.7% of MPs are from the Sikh community. Compare that to only 0.9% of the population. So again, you can see how politically active and successful they've been, and therefore the influence they're having on the government. Then in our upper house, called the House of Lords, we have 7 Sikh peers, Lords as they're called, which is just under 1%, which reflects again the proportion of the population. Here in the UK, we're a slightly different situation in that we have a government, a Labour government particularly, that's reflecting very much the attitudes of its previous Conservative government, who for some reason, we discussed these at great length in different shows, for some reason is not representative of the Sikh community. Those people who actually even elected the current Labour government, they have betrayed our Sikh community, despite the fact that we have 11 Sikh MPs. Their voices has been drowned out. And in fact, even questions have been raised that some of our Sikh MPs here in the UK have actually been influenced by Hindutva forces, and they are not, therefore, actually representing their very own Sikh constituents. So there you go, Leyla, a quick snapshot of the key diaspora numbers.
Indeed. And this is something that we've talked about in the past. You know, it's widely known that the Khalistan movement is both peaceful and democratic, relying on those principles to win the battle against an increasingly anti-democratic Indian government. So for Khalistan to be established, it will require a democratic mandate. You know, one way the campaign is attempting to achieve this is by holding the global referendum amongst the diaspora. So what is the purpose and legal status of this referendum, and what is its symbolic impact?
Yes, the referendum has been a resounding success, there's no question. It's been held across several countries, including the UK, Switzerland, Italy, USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And it's still going on. I think the next iteration is in Ottawa shortly. So it's been a resounding success. The turnout has been enormous. We've had tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Sikhs from the community turning out, most flying these wonderful yellow Khalistan flags. They've always been very happy, peaceful occasions, the family occasions. Whole families have turned out to vote in the referendum. They've been really a real example of how positive democracy can be and how uniting it can be. Now, it has actually, and the big question, of course, comes, and as part of your question, Leyla, is how legally binding is it? How significant is it? Does it really matter? Is really the crux of this. The answer to that is yes, it really does matter, because for whatever reasons, India will, certainly at the moment, not allow any referendum in the Punjab. Again, because it sees any talk of Khalistan as illegal. And therefore, it will not hold a referendum. And likewise, it is likely that if it did hold a referendum, it would lose, as in the Khalistan movement would win that referendum. And it knows that. That's probably why it won't hold it in the Punjab. So the only thing that the Sikh community can do is, OK, we'll hold our own referendum. Obviously, we can't hold it in the Punjab because we'll all go to prison if we do. So we'll have to hold it across the diaspora. And they've been doing that. And it's been an absolutely resounding success. Huge turnout, as I said. And again, it's just been a massive sea of Khalistan flags. Now, how legitimate is it? Well, obviously, it's not an official referendum. It's not legally binding in any way, shape or form. Having said that, Sikhs for Justice, who've organised this referendum, have been absolutely meticulous in ensuring that every element that they can control matches the normal protocols of any normal, legal, democratic referendum, wherever it's held in any democratic nation. As a result, they appointed what's called the Punjab Referendum Commission. to oversee it. This is a panel of independent and non-aligned, as in totally independent, direct democracy and political experts, and their mission is to monitor that voting and ensuring that everything is done according to normal democratic protocols. In other words, you can't pick it apart legally. In other words, it's not gifting any ammunition to India to say, but you didn't do this or you didn't do that. Well, they could say, no, actually, the whole thing it followed all the legal norms, all the checks and balances, the tick boxes, etc., the belt and braces, whatever, to ensure that legally it matched everything that was within their control, and that therefore could essentially be, in all but name, given as a legal referendum. Now, the big question is, though, really, to wrap this up, could this same referendum be held in Punjab? The goal, obviously, I assume, I don't know for sure, but I'm sure the goal of Sikhs for Justice is to hold this referendum in the Punjab. Will they? How will they? That's a question I can't answer, but we're all hoping that it will. I think it's likely that the question is, will they release the results of the referendum before that? I suspect not, because we all know, judging by the sea of flags that turn up, that it's going to be an overwhelming yes for Khalistan. The question is, though, what will Narendra Modi's reaction be to that? He'll just ignore it. He'll dismiss it. But that's the reason why he won't hold it in the Punjab, because he knows that same result probably will be reflected in the Punjab, Leyla.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think will be the result, and do you think that this will have any impact on India?
Yes, I think it's very clear the result, as I said. It will be a resounding yes. You only need to see the people who turn out to the referendum. And as I say, this wonderful whole vista of yellow Khalistani flags. I would pretty much say, even without even talking to anybody there, I would say that clearly the overwhelming majority, 90+% of people there, will be supporting that referendum. Now, there is an argument to say, well, of course they would, because if you're against Khalistan, you're not even going to turn up, because you're just going to dismiss it. So there is an argument, which obviously we have to acknowledge. But ultimately, the sheer numbers, the sheer volume of people in proportion to the population of those diasporas who are turning up, I think that sends a very, very clear message that the Khalistan movement is overwhelmingly pro-Khalistan, that the Punjab Sikh community will likewise reflect those people in the diaspora, that they will overwhelmingly support the concept of Khalistan. And it's likely that not even just the Sikh community, it's likely that other communities in the Punjab, even Hindus, will likely support the concept of Khalistan, because they will understand what it brings. They will understand the concept that everybody's treated equal. There is no caste system. It rejects the caste system. That's one of the key issues that affects the Hindu community. So it's likely that Hindus will see it and say, actually, you know what? I want to be a part of a country where I'm treated not as lower caste or even middle class. I'm treated as an equal. We're all the same. We're all equal. So that's the attraction of it. And most importantly of all is that when the results come out for that referendum, it creates a hugely powerful legal tool, a legal weapon to go to bodies like the United Nations and say, look, here, there is overwhelming support for the concept of Khalistan. Is that you've got to acknowledge our democratic right, firstly, to hold the referendum in the Punjab, and secondly, if that referendum and when that referendum is won by the Khalistan campaign, is that India will have no option but to recognise and acknowledge that result and support the establishment of the sovereign nation of Khalistan.
Indeed. It's fascinating stuff, fighting the good fight, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the results are going to be. And I love the fact that you have such a wealth of knowledge to bring us through all of history to present day. It really, truly has such an impact. And like you have always said, you have to know your history in order for this sovereign nation to exist.
Exactly, and that is it. And as I say, there are so many aspects to this whole story of Khalistan, but it's the Sikh community who are driving it. They're the ones behind it, obviously, because they're the ones who will benefit the most. But as I often say, it's not just the Sikh community who will benefit from the establishment of Khalistan, it will be the global community. And that is why
Indeed.
We will continue to campaign for it. But once again, a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much, Leyla, for joining us once again. Thank you to our audience for watching. And all I would say is we hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time.